I call Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's been just over 5 years since the very tragic earthquakes in Canterbury. And, Sir, we've learnt an awful lot as a nation and as a parliament in that preceding 5 years. And I guess, Sir, one of the great learnings to have come out of the tragedy that took place in Canterbury 5 years ago is a recognition that so many other parts of New Zealand are in fact vulnerable to earthquake, and so many of our older buildings around the country are at risk, and not only the buildings but the people who live, work and spend time in those buildings are at risk as well. And so, Sir, this piece of legislation really goes to the root of what it is to try and ensure that at some stage in the future, if we are as a nation to be hit again by a tragic earthquake, that our buildings and workspaces are in a better state than some of those in Christchurch were 5 years ago. The bill, as originally introduced back in December 2013, has been significantly and radically changed, and so the bill that we are considering here today in third reading is a much changed piece of legislation. And I guess, Sir, that reflects that this is a very complex policy area. It's a policy area that is fraught with difficulty because it involves land, property rights, buildings, money, and heritage buildings and a whole range of other risks. And overlaid across those components are the relative seismic risks from different parts of the country. The geographic seismic risk varies from part to part around our nation. So this bill now, very importantly, removes the one-size-fits-all approach that was present in the original legislation as first introduced. And the bill now provides a proportionate responses to the risks that I've been talking about. It minimises the cost to property owners, it spreads out the timeframes involved for remediating properties, and it seeks to retain as much of New Zealand's heritage buildings as is possible. So this varying of timeframes and measuring against that seismic risk is very important. So the time frame now for identification of buildings will be 5, 10 and 15 years depending on the seismic risk, and then the time frames for the actual strengthening of the buildings will be 15, 25 and 35 years. And so this is a complete change from what was originally introduced in the bill. So another major change has been that the bill now prioritises and gives special status to educational buildings and emergency buildings such as schools, universities and hospitals. And those in high seismic risk areas will need to be identified and upgraded within half the time frames of other buildings. And Sir, I think that's a very pragmatic and sensible approach to be taken for buildings that house people at greatest risk. The Select Committee was impressed, as previous speakers have said, by the compelling submission from Anne Brower. She was the only survivor of the bus tragedy in Christchurch, and she highlighted the very real and important extra risks associated with unreinforced masonry on buildings, things like parapets, facades, verandas and the like. And so the committee, on the basis of her compelling submission, changed a piece of the legislation to include unreinforced masonry, and I think, if nothing else, Sir, that highlights the importance and the value of a good, rational, well-made submission at Select Committee and how important that process is to our legislative process as a parliament. So the provisions of the bill to structures such as farm sheds, retaining walls, fences, monuments, wharves, bridges, tunnels and storage tanks has actually been removed, and that those have been removed on the basis that those structures all comply or are required to comply with other codes that mean that it would be not necessary for this bill to be partly focused on those sorts of structures. So this is a very pragmatic, sensible now piece of legislation. It's radically changed from the bill that was originally introduced, and I'm very pleased that it has been, because the Select Committee and the Parliament have, I think, given it due consideration in a way that has produced now what will be a good piece of legislation that gives certainty and a time frame which building owners and property owners can work to. I commend it to the House.
Dr.